In the name of the Holy One who was and is to come. Amen. Please be seated. There's a whole gamut of human emotion on display this morning in these readings. From the shame and the hope of God's exiled people, as we heard from the prophet Zephaniah, to the deep trust in God's presence that we heard from the prophet Isaiah, to an apparently testy, impatient, and sour mood of John the Baptizer, who seems to want to call names this morning. Yet what I hope that we can land on is the Apostle Paul and his theology of joy. His encouragement of the people of the church at Philippi to rejoice in the Lord, rejoice always, to show their gentleness to everyone, and not to worry about anything, to trust and abide in the presence of God, which surpasses all understanding. Yes, these words are kind and encouraging, and yes, joy is right in keeping with the spirit of this season. And yet, on the other hand, rejoice always, never worry about anything? How is this possible? The peace that surpasses all understanding, how are we to latch on to such a thing? I remember still, 8 years later, hearing those words at my mother's funeral. The peace that surpasses all understanding, and how jarring and confusing they felt, because I wanted so much to grab onto something that made sense, and that wasn't it. So at times, these so-called words of encouragement that the Apostle Paul offers sound a bit tinny to the ears, sound a bit forced. Is Paul being Pollyanna? What is with the rose-colored glasses? This is the third Sunday of Advent, sometimes called Gaudete Sunday, the Latin. We light the pink candle, which is known as the candle of joy. In some churches, Catholic or Anglo-Catholic parishes, the clergy may wear pink or rose-colored vestments. It is a day to focus our hearts and minds on the joy that is to come, and perhaps to reflect a little bit deeper about what is meant by joy and rejoicing. Let's begin by remembering that Paul wrote those words from prison as he awaited trial and anticipated a likely death sentence. Now, Paul was not a shy person, and he loved to remind his churches and his fledgling followers and the followers of Christ that he had been threatened and beaten and shipwrecked and imprisoned multiple times, all in the work of spreading the gospel, all in the work of spreading the good news. So even with that little bit of background, I think we can see that Paul is not a Pollyanna. Paul is one whose faith had been tried and tried again. He knew very well the disappointments and the setbacks, the heartaches and the challenges that come as we all face and make our way through this world, especially as we live or try to live a life of faith. So how can we place Paul's context into our own? How can we make Paul's ideas about joy make sense for us? and make them something that we can grab onto. The joy that Paul commends to us is not something that can be earned or pursued or sought after. One of the foundational texts and contexts of our American social and moral and political life is that each of us has the right to pursue happiness. Happiness is pursued. Happiness is sought after. And happiness is sometimes tied up in the act of pursuit, as in that frantic search for a last-minute gift, or the waiting in line for the next greatest gadget. These may bring us happiness, but temporarily. Joy is something else altogether. The joy that Paul speaks of is not about feeling good, but about cultivating an inner peace and quiet that we don't create or achieve by ourselves, but that only comes through the grace of God. And with connection and intention toward God, that we can receive that through prayer and gentleness and compassion. These are the gifts of the Spirit that draw us away from our singular and short-lived pursuits of happiness and wants, and that draw us toward a deeper longing for connection. When we experience that longing for connection, we are entering into joy. When we can begin to see glimpses that the brokenness of the world as we experience it and the world that we long for are ever moving closer together, we are entering into joy. When we can live gently and persistently and patiently in that place of tension, where we are there and not yet there, we are entering into joy. Entering into joy. Entering into that kind of peace that surpasses all understanding. As we read in Bible study this week, it is the result of 1,000 letting goes. 1,000 letting goes. Letting go makes room for the grace and joy to enter in. Prepare them room. A friend of mine recently came back from a pilgrimage to Ireland, where part of her time was spent living and working as a volunteer at a monastery of sorts, a place called Corrymeela, a place where people who are preparing room within themselves go for peace and solitude and maybe a different kind of connection with one another and with God. My friend said, I knew my time there was short, and I wanted to get to know people at a deeper God level. Usually you have to play 20 questions to get to that place. So I knew I needed to start with the 21st question. So instead of asking people that she met, where are you from? Or what do you do? She asked them this: what brings you joy? What brings you joy? Here's some of what she heard from Aaron, who works at the reception desk at Corrymeela, who has a form of dwarfism. What brings Aaron joy is being in a place where she can be accepted for who she is, without being labeled or defined based on her physical stature. From Royson, who was a chef at Corrymeela. What brings Royson joy is that he has found family with the other chefs and the kitchen staff, while his biological family is half a world away. From Roseanne, a nurse, what brings her joy is spending time with cancer patients and receiving the joy and love that so often transforms them in their illness into vessels of hope. As the days draw closer to the anticipated birth that we have been awaiting, I urge you to slow down and abide in joy. When you meet another person, perhaps instead of "how are you?" instead of "are you ready for Christmas?" how about "what brings you joy?" What you receive may be a wonderful and unexpected gift. Amen.